All right, hey everyone, back with another episode of Shtajio's vlog. This is episode 38, and I am Henry Thurlow.
Arthur Isom.
And we are Shtajio.
Shtajio.
Gotta get that pronunciation at the beginning of every episode. Shtajio. All right, there you go. So this week we're thinking about a topic, and some things that come up online are fans or potentially creators arguing about the animation process, and this animation looks the best and this animation looks the best, and here's why the animation failed, and things like that. And there's so much misinformation out there, it's kind of ridiculous. So I thought we could tackle one of those today. Okay. I got to be honest with you, I'll probably end up just ranting through most of this video because you're art director. I'm the animator. So if we're talking specifically about animation, I think I'll largely be ranting. But if you got anything to say, chime in. And then on a future episode, we'll do some background related thing. Or you could just rant and I'll be like, oh, wow. That's interesting.
That's interesting. Okay.
So here's what I was thinking. Frames per second. Especially on Twitter, where people, like to shout about any craziness. There's just so much, I think misinformation out there. So you've got people saying oh man, games are 60 frames per second. Why shouldn't animation be 60 frames per second? Mm-hmm. And recently, people have been speeding up animation clips, old animation clips. I think they had some kind of filter to them. It's not just about speeding up. Mm-hmm. They had some kind of, I forget what it's called, but it someone there. They had some kind of filter that alters the old 24 frame per second even Disney films into 60 frames per second, and it looks horrible. It is gross. It is, and some people are even look at how great this looks, and I'm like, this is gonna give me I'm gonna have a seizure looking at this.
It's just everything's moving quickly.
It works for games because you're not watching it like a film and looking at everything. You're looking at it as if it is your actual point of view, and you expect just perfect. If I want to look up there and look over there and look around the side of there.
Point A to point B. That's a good point, because in games, especially our first-person shooters and things like that, there isn't anything moving, right? You're moving. You yourself are moving, and so when the camera is moving from left to right, generally you're just kind of glancing over the vista, looking for the other person that's probably hiding behind something, and then maybe the character might come running out in between that time. But there's not
film is 24 frames per second. This was discovered 100 years ago plus, right? When film was made. The original Disney films, if we're talking about animation specifically, were all 24 frames per second, and 24 frames per second has been what has remained to this day. It's what all film is. Actual film is 24 frames per second.
Well, depending on which country, right? So they're 24 for
23.999. Okay, there's some little caveats out there. But generally speaking, 24 frames per second is film, right? And video is 30 frames per second. When I was in college, my first few things I animated, my thesis film, was done on video, video speed, 30 frames per second. So let me see. 24 frames per second is enough to convince you that things are moving real, like real life. It is you can be 100% convinced with that. That is why all movies, all film throughout all of time, The Godfather, right? All film has been that many frames per second. That is enough to convince your eyes fully of natural motion, right? It doesn't need to be more than that. Now, in reality, there's no such thing as frames, right? And so film is just imitating real motion with that amount of frames.
With a whole bunch of still images.
Yes.
Because it's not real.
Video upped that to 30, and it really isn't distinguishable realistically from one another. Now, if you're on the creative side of it, I noticed that putting things on twos on video, which would mean 15 drawings per your 1 second, right? Because there's 30 in total, and every other one it would change. That's about kind of equal to the smoothness of on ones at 24 frames per second, normal film. Not exactly, but that's kind of how I interpret it. If I was doing something on twos on video, I'm like, this is going to be ultra smooth, just like the way ones are ultra smooth on film. So animation, I guess, through when Disney kind of started animation, right? Like feature film animation, they imitated film, which is that, well, on film, every single frame of the 24 frames per second needs to change into something different. So they always put their things on ones. Yeah. In fact, I don't even know if there was a phrase ones and twos back then. It was just obviously we need to imitate film. So there is an advancement of the film where here's the next film strip. And so we need a new drawing. So every second there would be 24 frames throughout the whole movie from start to finish. But then as animation continued, someone realized, I don't know who, you don't actually need to change it every single one. In fact, every other one, which results in 12 frames per second, but consistently every other one, it's still really, really smooth. Yeah. So Beauty and the Beast, I noticed. I always thought kind of all Disney animation was totally on ones, but I remember a bunch of years back, I was looking at the Beauty and the Beast DVD, and I was kind of going frame by frame, and I noticed, I was like, oh wait, I just clicked twice, and it didn't change. So even Disney feature film realized at some point if it's not a crazy fast action sequence where every frame should be in a different position, you can actually get away with 12 frames, still convincing the eye that this is perfectly smooth motion, right?
Yeah, although I guess typically Western animation still does just generally always animate on ones, right? They did a good explanation of the reasoning behind ones and twos with that Into the Spider-Verse. I like their explanation, right? Because they were saying that with Spider-Man, when they wanted him to kind of feel like he was into what he was doing, and he had no questions about his movement. They wanted it to be smooth, so they did it on ones. Because like Henry said, when you animate on ones, that's the smoothest the animation can be, right? Like because it
moves exactly identical to live action film.
Like move from hair to hair. In real life, there's a whole bunch of hands that you would see between here. When you animate on twos, that the motion is faster, it's choppier. And
although I need to say, well, finish your thought process, because it goes beyond this. Because then I was going to say anime in particular even realized you don't even need that. You can get away with threes. Right? And Into the Spider-Verse is uniquely choppy at some parts, not in a bad way. I'm not like one of the people dissing it online. I think it's awesome, right? And obviously there's complete mixing and matching where ones and twos and threes and probably fours go. Same scene. And it's awesome. But that actually proves the point. So yes, once you get into threes, then it does start to get a little bit choppier, and yet you can still convince people of decent motion with it if used properly.
Yeah, exactly.
And like last year we worked on Castlevania Season 3. And I noticed even in that it was kind of going up and down from like ones, twos, threes, and then even some fours. Like some characters that like could really like were going into slow-mo or like stopping for a second. Like personally, I probably wouldn't do that with my stuff. I would probably, even when it moved slow, I would still want the lots of drawings in the slow part. But they realized that when it gets slow, even if like these few are choppy, well, it was slow anyway. So to be honest, if it's nice and detailed and pleasing to the eyes, it's okay. And then we'll be back to the nice smooth motion in a split second.
Interesting you bring up slow motion, because then throughout Henry's explanation, he's comparing live action to animation. And in live action, that's when they actually do use 60 frames per second or above, right? It's when they're about to slow something down. So they actually do. That's the only time that they shoot more than 24 frames per second. So if you know that later you're about to slow this down, then they add more frames to it. They'll usually shoot at 60.
In film, though, you would revert it back to 24, right? Like you'd shoot it more, and then but when you put it on the actual, especially if we're going back to film time, you'd then put it at 24. You put it back to whatever. But because you had more, it moves slow, right? But I think that's important to say, because to go back to the original point of why I'm making this, to kind of challenge the crazy people on Twitter, like.
They're not all crazy. Some of you are.
Some of you are.
You know who you are.
Some people are like, oh, an anime is bad if it's animated on twos, which means only 12 frames a second. God, if it was 24, it'd be great. Or God, if it was 60. How come they can't make it 60? Guys. 24 frames per second convinces the eye of natural motion.
Yeah.
The end. This has been a proven fact. Unless you think live action movies are also not smooth, then you've already also accepted that fact. Live action movies move at 24 frames per second. And so now it's just how you utilize those frames.
Yeah, it's what's in the frame.
Yeah.
I think people are mixing up 24 frames per second and then, like you say, animating on ones or animating on twos. It's still 24 frames per second, but now you just either have more frames in that 24.
Yes. That also needs to be reiterated. Some people are like, oh, this one's only 12 frames per second. No. Every single anime in Japan is 24 frames per second. Unless there's some maybe net animation that decided to do it video at 30, but that would be super rare and unique, and that let's ignore that for a second. It's all 24. Akira is 24. The recent Kimetsu no Yaiba Demon Slayer movie is 24. One Piece is 24. Ghibli movies are 24. It's all 24. Now, do you move the characters on ones, twos, and threes, meaning that like the actual drawing changes more or less within that 24 frames per second? That's up for debate. But every one of the 24 frames is a new frame, right?
And then I know that there's going to be the crazies who are like, well, actually, and then so obviously there are two. So depending on if you use the NTSC system or the PAL system, so then the frames are different. So normally it would have been animated at 24 frames, but then they adjust it for the European system, right? Which would then be 30 frames per second. Sorry, 25 frames per second, which is...
I've actually never worked on that system, to be honest. I don't think 25.
Yeah, so sometimes... I think we did do one commercial.
The Adidas commercial,
The Adidas
right?
commercial.
Yeah,
we did that in 25 frames because that was specifically for...
We live in an interesting time now, though, where computers can just render out that stuff so much easier, which is why I probably forgot about it, because we could move forward with 24 frames per second, and the one out of every like 200 frames that just got dropped because of the change, I didn't really notice so much. In the past, though, that would have been a huge thing. From day one, you would have needed to very meticulously plan that extra frame would drop.
Which frame would you be dropping, or which one would you be adding? Because it does look weird, right? Yeah. Because you can't just speed it up to 25 frames per second, because now there's a thing
that if you make it at one speed and then change it to another speed, what ends up happening is everyone uses a different term. I've heard it as like a ghosting effect, where and this even happens within Japanese anime because it was made during the cell era, and then when they change it over to digital, or even some digital things, I think like in one program they would animate it at 24, but then when they bring that into the other program to render it, sometimes I've noticed like it might have been 24 both times, but if it doesn't line up equally when they do the final render, when you go frame by frame, you don't see this drawing, this drawing, this drawing. You see a blur between this drawing and this drawing, and then a blur between this drawing and this drawing. Now,
but it's not between every drawing too, right? Like, cause it's like it's trying to figure out how.
Exactly, it's trying to. So sometimes it finds it. Sometimes it's like, oh, the 9,000th frame is this, and the 9,001st frame is this. But then all of a sudden, the next few, they're like, I think this is right. I think this is right. I think this is right. The first time I noticed that, really, and maybe normal anime fans don't notice it so much, but me as an animator, I go crazy when I see this. The first time I noticed it kind of professionally was there's an anime, Katekyo Hitman Reborn. It's another jump anime with a long like fighting series, but it has the opening cinemas were always really, really nice, right? The openings, that's always nice in anime, but this one in particular had really, really cool fight sequences during the opening animation. But there was one opening where the animation was great, but every frame was that. And I think they might have done it intentionally, because again, I don't know why that would mess up. They were making it digitally the whole time. Whether it was a mess up or whether it was intentional, I would see that and I would be like, this is amazingly drawn animation, but it drives me nuts because no frame is actually a clear drawing. It is a half drawing every time. And to me, it just looks all blurred when that happens. So, yeah. Frames per second is always 24, but then how those frames are utilized matters. But to the people out there that just go like, if you upped it to 60, boom, it'd be perfect. Not the case. 1s, 2s, and 3s used appropriately throughout your animation, it could look completely appropriate the whole way through, or inappropriate if you don't utilize those correctly. But it really has nothing to do with the frame rate. It's how you utilize your frames, right? I've even seen some animations where they put it all on 1s. Sometimes there's like an anime opening or an ending that isn't very good, to be honest. Usually anime openings are awesome. But sometimes I see one where I'm like, I don't know if I really like that one. I'm not going to name names, obviously, for this case. But sometimes I watch it and I'm like, but they tried to hide the bad animation with 1s, I noticed. Like, it was bad animation, but it moved suddenly like really super hyper smooth for a moment, but it didn't fix it. See, 1s didn't fix your problem. It was the keys and how like expressive the keys were and your timing of like how long did he hold his arm in the air before whipping down? It could be like, this could all be on 3s, and then you have just 2 1s when he swings down, and then 3s again for the... And it might look like an awesome swing of the sword, right? Whereas, if these keys aren't good, I don't care if you put the whole thing even on 1s, it's just going to look like that. It'll look super smooth, but it'll just look like that. So, it's all about the poses, and it's all about the animator utilizing how long he holds the exposure.
The animator's sense of timing.
It has nothing to do with frames per second. That is always 24, and that is totally fine. That is what all film is, the end. I don't want to hear if it was 60 frames or if it was 30 frames, it would have looked better. That is never the case. All good?
There you have it.
So go ahead, tell me why I'm wrong in the comments. Yes. I'm not, but go ahead, tell me.
Tell us why 60 is better.
All right. Shtajio ga daiji.
Shtajio ga daiji.
See you guys next time.
Peace.